So is the story of Jesus' resurrection a fact, or is it folklore like Bigfoot or other cases of unreliable eyewitness testimony? I'll cut to the chase. It's fact.
Oh, no, it's not. Jesus had a failed prophecy of the arrival of God's kingdom. The resurrection is a legend, and the ascension is a myth. Okay, Trent, now we have something that we can debate. Today I will show how Catholic apologists routinely exaggerate favorable evidence while they hide compromising evidence from their Catholic audiences. Listen to my comments and ask yourself a simple question. Why would anybody trust a professional Catholic apologist?
Skeptics claim that groups of people see all sorts of things that don't exist. For example, on the Joe Rogan podcast, the intelligent design advocate Stephen Meyer brought up witnesses reporting Jesus' resurrection.
He records the basic facts of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, including being crucified under Pontius Pilate. And then that there were reports that he had appeared to many after being resurrected. So there's a whole...
Right, but there's reports of Bigfoot.
I do hope to be a little more thorough than the great American philosopher and scholar Joe Rogan.
Seeing Bigfoot became a way of gaining prestige and living in the limelight, at least temporarily. But those elements are not present in the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. When the disciples preached that they saw the risen Jesus, the book of Acts says they received things like painful whippings, not positive reinforcement.
Trent, go and read the book of Acts again. Even if the stories were true, they don't support your claims. The apostles became celebrities. They had powerful friends, and they left the lives of Galilean fishermen to make a living for them and their wives by preaching the gospel.
Thank you. We'll go to Dana now in Orange County. Hi, Dana.
Hi, Patrick. I'm under the impression that from reading the book of Acts that the apostles really did benefit from preaching the gospel and have become celebrities. They have stories of people lining the streets in the hopes that Peter's shadow would touch them. That sounds very celebrity-like. There's stories of a Roman centurion bowing down publicly to Peter's feet, and stories about a wealthy Christian community laying money at Peter and John's feet. And I'm thinking, if they were lowly fishermen or fishermen on the Sea of Galilee prior to meeting Jesus, and after Jesus' death, they would be benefiting in prestige and even finances. If we're to believe what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, they get to keep some of the money that's laid at their feet. Those who serve at the altar, get to share what is given at the altar, and those who preach the gospel make their living from the gospel. So I'm looking at these stories and thinking, wow, this is actually significant benefits, for somebody that was making a living as a fisherman prior to that. What are your thoughts?
I don't care. I don't care if that's what you think. When I read the Gospels, I come up with a very different impression of that. So if that's your way of reading them and that's what you think, okay.
Would I be wrong in interpreting them like that? I mean, do you think that a Roman centurion bowing down at Peter's feet would be an example of prestige, and that Peter might have some feelings of, liking that type of power to get this powerful military person to be referent to him in that way, and that could cause somebody to exaggerate claims?
No, I don't.
That's it, just a straight answer. Do you have any explanation, follow-up comments on that?
Yeah, I interpret it differently. I interpret that as a sign of conversion and on the part of the centurion an act of humility. And I don't see anything in that text that suggests that St. Peter was reveling in that or that it went to his head. Yeah, I have a totally different interpretation of these verses than you do.
Yeah, well, I would admit, Peter, to his credit, as Cornelius is bowing at his feet, he does say, hey, I'm just a man, get up. And then he encourages him to get up. So I think that you make a good point there. Do you think it's completely unreasonable for a rational person to maybe read this story so and interpret it that, hey, these guys are getting money. Paul is saying they're making a living doing this. Do you think a rational, reasonable person might interpret it as that, no, they actually are benefiting, and when we hear that they were receiving no benefits whatsoever, that would be an exaggeration? Is that a reasonable conclusion to make?
Yes.
So that could create confusion as to whether these apostles did or did not have reasons to lie about the resurrection, exaggerate the claims that they were making if they were getting that kind of power. It would be reasonable to come to that conclusion.
No, it would not.
And what would your argument be to that it's not reasonable to come to that conclusion?
Because the vast preponderance of the evidence shows that they did not benefit in the ways that you are suggesting that they benefited. So you're leaving out all the juicy parts about how they were hounded and persecuted and rounded up by the Sanhedrin initially and whipped, and ultimately all of them met grisly deaths of martyrdom. So you're leaving out the parts where St. Paul talks about his experiences. Second Corinthians chapter 11. He says, are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless beatings, often near death. 5 times I have received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I have been beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I have been shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been adrift at sea. I guarantee, Dana, that you yourself could not endure the kind of sufferings that St. Paul did. I don't think I could either. And so you seem to be turning a blind eye to the many examples, that being one of them, of the terrible sufferings and deprivations and persecutions and ultimately death. So no, I think you could reasonably say, yeah, they did get some income to keep food in their bellies and keep clothes on their backs, but were they prestigious, high on the hog, influential guys who had it all made? No, absolutely not. That's not reasonable to assume. Thank you.
Let's further expose Patrick Madrid's half-truths. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul writes a braggadocious rant about his sufferings, which includes claims he was beaten with rods and stoned. Paul does not give details of these individual events, but Luke, the master historian in the book of Acts, does provide details. Let's take a close examination of the detailed story of Paul being beaten with rods to demonstrate how Patrick Madrid nefariously leaves out critical information. The first problem for modern Catholics is right at the story's beginning. The author depicts slavery as an acceptable part of everyday life. Paul and his entourage are headed to a place of prayer when we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. The woman is a piece of property, and her worth as a human being is based on how much money she can make for her owners. The story depicts the slave woman following Paul's entourage and shouting, "These men serve the Most High God, and they know how to become saved." Even though the slave woman seems to be allied with Paul's evangelism, he becomes annoyed and tells the spirit possessing the woman, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." Immediately, the spirit leaves the slave woman. The slave's owners realize Paul's exorcism turned their once valuable fortune-telling slave into a worthless commodity. The slave's owners are enraged with Paul because he just cost them a lot of money. They drag Paul to the magistrate, who strip him naked, beat him with rods, and shackle him in prison. Paul's beating with rods has nothing to do with preaching the gospel. It's all about money. I'll leave the rest of reading this wild mythical tale to yourselves. But spoiler alert, like most of the theme of these persecution stories, Paul ends up being the honored guest while his tormentors beg him for forgiveness. Patrick Madrid quoted 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul writes about being stoned once. This stoning event is depicted in the book of Acts with details that Patrick Madrid left out. The story depicts the people believing that Paul and his companion Barnabas are pagan gods who have come down to earth in human form to visit them. Ironically, Christians dismiss the idea of pagan gods coming to earth in human form as mythology, while readily accepting the Christian God coming to earth in human form as factual history. Paul immediately rebukes these pagan believers and he starts preaching the gospel. Much like the situation today, there's a simmering tension between the Jewish leadership and Christians. This tension boils over into violence, and the Jews attack Paul. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. But wait a minute. Paul goes from near death to being able to get up and head back into the city. Then the next day he leaves for Derbe. That's a 60-mile trip. Catholics will say that Paul was miraculously healed when the apostles gathered around him. I say the whole story is legendary fiction. Either way, Paul does not appear to be seriously injured.
And finally, the Gospels include the testimony, T, of women discovering the tomb. In Jesus' time, a woman's testimony was considered to be as reliable as that of a child or a criminal. A collection of ancient Jewish wisdom called the Talmud says, the words of the Torah should be burned rather than entrusted to women. The Jewish historian Josephus said that a woman's levity and boldness made her testimony unreliable. If the gospel authors had invented the story about Jesus' tomb being found empty, they would have likely used trustworthy characters like Peter or John. The embarrassing detail about women discovering the empty tomb was included in the story simply because that's what really happened.
If I tried getting away with this dishonesty in court, I'd be ridiculed in front of judge and jury. The women finding Jesus' tomb empty are literally described in childlike terms. They're trembling and bewildered and speaking nonsense. The women are not an embarrassing detail because they're described as hysterical, untrustworthy, and their testimony is not believed. Why does Trent leave this information out of his monologues? On a closer examination, the women at the empty tomb is a convoluted hot mess. Mark's original gospel depicts the women being trembling and bewildered, and they don't say anything to anyone. Mark's forged ending describes Mary Magdalene reporting a risen Jesus, but the male disciples do not believe her. Matthew's gospel describes the women seeing a risen Jesus, but it doesn't describe them reporting it to anyone. Luke's gospel describes the women speaking nonsense and nobody believes them. John's gospel turns the whole story upside down and contradicts the other three. The reports of an empty tomb by the women are believed immediately, and Peter and the shadowy other disciple literally race each other and are described as believing right when they go inside. We have 3 reports of bewildered women and 1 report of women getting immediate action. Trent's argument is dependent on John's gospel being accurate, while Mark, Matthew, and Luke are wrong. Trent constantly uses progressive revelation to explain biblical slavery, raping war brides, and unjust biblical violence. The idea that God teaches people slowly over time when they are ready to hear his perfect message. The good old boy Catholic Church throws progressive revelation right out the window when it comes to female church leadership. To this very day, the Catholic Church teaches educated, motivated, and capable women like they are adored house pets.
Hi everybody, Cardinal Dolan, still here in Rome, still at the North American College, the Casa Santa Maria on the Via dell'Umiltà. And this is also not only the residence for priests that come to do graduate studies in theology and philosophy, but also our acclaimed visitor's office for American pilgrims to the Holy See. Sister Mary Vaughn it is?
Sister Mary Vaughn, yes.
Thank you for what you do. You're an alma mercy sister.
That's right.
And you've been here, well, the sisters have been here a good 30 years.
That's right.
So what, and your work here is?
So our work here is just to be a hospitable, welcoming presence to Americans who come to Rome and help them get tickets to Wednesday audiences or any liturgies with the Holy Father.
How was Holy Week? Busy?
real busy. We're still recovering.
Now you got the whole year coming up.
We got it coming,
2025.
yeah.
Are you preparing for it?
We're working hard, yeah.
Way to go.
Law enforcement had the same problem. We learned we are better now than we were before. Women earned leadership roles, and modern police officers recognize their ability to command.
Recently been informed that another victim recently died at the hospital. I have to say again, this investigation is in its infancy. It occurred just a short 4 hours ago. We are still in our investigative phase. The search and securing of the college is almost complete. The search is being handled by 11 multi-jurisdictional, multidisciplinary, meaning police and fire teams.
Also keep in mind that Paul's letter to the Corinthians and the Gospels describe Jesus appearing not just to individuals, but to groups of people like the 12. A group might misidentify a real thing as something else, but they're not going to all hallucinate seeing the same thing that is not there.
I'm suspicious that Trent has not studied these group appearance claims, so let's point out what he does not seem to know. Luke's gospel depicts Jesus appearing to his disciples in Jerusalem, and some of them are doubting. Jesus has to tell them, stop doubting and believe. Even after that, they're still described as doubting. Matthew's gospel depicts Jesus now in Galilee, appearing before his 11 surviving apostles. He is standing right in front of them, and some of them doubt it. Jerusalem and Galilee are about 90 miles apart. Jesus' group appearances demonstrate that some of his apostles were doubting his resurrection in more than one place and over a course of time. If there's any historical value to these reports at all, it does provide evidence some of Jesus' inner circle were openly doubting his resurrection. Paul's letter to the Corinthians makes the group appearance claim even worse. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 15 for yourself. Catholics love to talk about Jesus appearing before 500 witnesses.
Our earliest source for Jesus' disciples that they claim to see the risen Lord, it doesn't come from the Gospels. It comes from the witnesses described in 1 Corinthians 15. So already you have the bedrock evidence for the Christian faith.
But they don't talk about the overall context. The whole thing is an angry rant by Paul, who is writing to the Corinthians because some of them don't believe in the resurrection. He appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also. But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. With Paul's typical passive-aggressive language, he lets everybody know that he's mad about it. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Paul frequently describes himself as suffering greatly and constantly being in life-threatening situations. And then often in the same paragraph, he twists that around and brags about how he's the most successful evangelist. Let's take a quick look at some of the writings of Paul. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report. That man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, and they praised God because of me. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and will continue with all of you in your progress in joy and faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ will abound because of me. Paul's writings provide evidence that he was a self-absorbed narcissist. These are not the personality traits that we consider to be trustworthy. Another example of Catholic exaggeration is the story of the apostles being flogged by the Jewish high court, often called the Sanhedrin. The story begins with the apostles performing many signs and wonders in front of large groups of believers who are giving them a significant amount of personal attention.
Seeing Bigfoot became a way of gaining prestige and living in the limelight, at least temporarily. But those elements are not present in the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection.
Yes, they are. The Jewish high court is so filled with jealousy at the attention the apostles are getting that they throw them in a public jail. But the apostles immediately escape with the mythical assistance of an angel, and by daybreak are right back preaching in the temple courts. The temple guards quickly locate the fugitive apostles, and then something is depicted that is never mentioned by Catholic apologists. The captain and his officers went and brought the apostles. They did not use force because they were afraid the people would stone them. The captain and his officers are afraid of being stoned. The apostles are not lowly fishermen turned into persecuted evangelists. Not at all. Preaching the gospel turned them from fishermen into men with control over crowds, men who struck fear in the temple guards, and men who outraged the religious elite with jealousy. It's important to remember, immediately prior to this story, Peter is involved in the public death of two people. He is not some benevolent, innocent man. At times, he's a violent provocateur. He arms himself for battle. He cut off someone's ear, and he mocked a dying woman. Pay attention to the details motivating the Sanhedrin's murderous anger. At the trial's beginning, the high priest demonstrates his sensitivity to being accused of murdering Jesus by stating, "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name," he said. "Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teachings and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood." As the trial concludes, Peter ends his defense statement by stating, "The God of our ancestors raised Jesus from the dead, whom you killed by hanging him on a cross." The high court is angered by the allegation that is made that they murdered the Messiah. Also, all of this is hearsay. None of it was written by Peter. None of it was written by any apostle. None of it was written by the high court. All of it was written by Luke, a later theologian. My YouTube channel has a video on why the writings of Luke are filled with mistakes, myth, and legend. Back to the story. A Pharisee named Gamaliel intercedes on the apostles' behalf and calms the Sanhedrin down, saving the apostles from being stoned. If there's any truth to this story at all, Catholics do have a solid piece of evidence that the apostles put themselves in life-threatening situations by preaching the gospel. I would like to suggest that people often take risks to benefit themselves. The apostles wanted power. The apostles got power. They were celebrities, and they were making a living for themselves and their wives by preaching the gospel. The apostles did have reasons to take risks. After Gamaliel's intercession, the high court has the apostles flogged, which is something that Catholics routinely bring up. What they don't bring up is the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. So how bad was this flogging? Were the risks worth the rewards? I am certainly guilty of speculation, but the temple guards are likely the ones who flogged the apostles. They are the same people who did not use force on the apostles because they were afraid they would be stoned by the apostles' supporters. Did the temple guards take it easy on the apostles so as not to be later stoned by their supporters? That's a fair question to ask. After the flogging, the apostles are joyous, and they're physically capable of proclaiming the good news day after day and from house to house. Less than 1 day in jail, flogged by people who are afraid of your supporters, and afterwards you're joyous and do not appear to be injured. That is information that you are not going to hear from self-serving Catholic. Trent's claims of reliable evidence are not matching up to the information provided in these legendary and mythical tales. Take some time to study the difference between the context in Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 5. In Acts chapter 1, a resurrected Jesus is described as talking, eating food, answering questions, and giving his apostles many proofs over a 40-day period of time that he is alive. In Acts chapter 5, the Jewish Sanhedrin seem to believe that Jesus is nothing more than a murder victim that they are personally accused of killing. The Sanhedrin don't seem to be aware of any evidence that Jesus was alive for 40 days, yet they are the very people in Jerusalem who would have had first-hand access to that evidence. I'm curious, if there's so much evidence to Jesus' resurrection, why didn't the Sanhedrin know about it? Ultimately, Jewish people have been a thorn in Christendom's foot for 2,000 years. Jews were the eyewitnesses, and Jews are the very people who don't believe in the resurrection and they don't believe in Jesus' divinity. I'm just a tiny YouTube channel with a few greatly appreciated subscribers. Nothing like Trent's massive and growing Catholic presence. If you want to spread new ideas, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. And always be prepared to give an answer why you don't believe, but do this with gentleness and respect, even if the Christians speak maliciously against your rational intellect. Stay safe.